Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Australian CFO Summit, and it's the special not-for-profit edition. So we're absolutely thrilled to have you all here today. If you want to kick off, you can start maybe chucking in the chat where you're coming to us from. And I'd like to begin in the spirit of reconciliation. WEAL acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people today. Now, first session, we have two experts in the field. So Kirsty McGovern and Edward Day, both from RSM. My name is Adriana Amato, and I work at WEAL, so Australia's leading spend management solution. I'd love to kick off and just understand, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the grants and the funding update, maybe Kirsty and Edward, if you could give us a little rundown, of your sort of experience and career to date.
Sure. RSM would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands across Australia. For me, I'm in Canberra and it's the Ngunnawal people. And for Edward, it's the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. And we acknowledge and celebrate the inherent strengths of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities. And we thank the many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, organisations and individuals that are guiding RSM as we take meaningful action to advance reconciliation. So a little bit about myself. I'm a senior manager. As I said, I work in the Canberra office at RSM. I've worked for nearly 10 years. Prior to that, I had a very long career in media and advertising. Not-for-profits is one of my specialties. I work on a range of different things like governance and strategy. We support organisations with change projects. We design a lot of restructuring and structuring initiatives to support strategy and member engagement. I've worked across a range of different areas in the not-for-profit sector, including DSS-funded national federated organisations, done a really big project on bowling clubs in the ACT, children's services, we're working with arts organisations, and also a number of member-based sort of really complex organisations with branches, for example. I'm the subject matter expert in the NDIS, and I do a lot of work around aged care and health as well. And we've delivered a range of transition support and business development programs. My team's very experienced in financial modelling, activity-based costing, all those types of that type of work. And we do a lot of work with organisations on financial performance and accountability. Do you want to talk about yourself, Edward?
Sure, thanks. Good morning, everyone. Yep. Edward Day, I'm a senior manager in RSM's government grants team. As you may be aware, the grant funding landscape is a complex one and one that is ever changing. So the key role that I play is helping organisations to navigate that landscape and put together compelling applications for funding to a range of programmes. Before joining RSM, I spent the last 4 years working with the West Australian State Government, managing their food and beverage fund, which is an industry development programme with a large grant component targeted at food and beverage manufacturers and post-farm gate value-add processors. So during that time, I designed and ran a range of grant funding programs. So I've seen it from the other side, from government perspective, in terms of what they're looking for. I've seen hundreds of applications over the years, so I could speak to really what government are looking for when they're seeking for funding applications, and what things might sort of frustrate a funder. Some top tips to avoid when you're considering applying to government for funding. In terms of today's session, we split into 4 areas and around 4 key themes. And we do invite you to use the chat or the Q&A function to ask us questions as we go through, if something pops to mind, and Adriana will sort of facilitate that for us. So the 4 things we're going to cover today will be how the grants can play a role in your funding strategy and some of the key things to be considering in that regard. Once you've identified that grant funding is the right thing for you, how do you find the right grant, and how do you assess that the grant that you're considering is actually worth investing the time and effort it takes to apply for that particular program. We'll then talk a bit about sort of how you put your best foot forward, what makes a compelling grant application, and finally, once you've got through that big hurdle of actually being awarded the grant, what are some tips to help you sort of manage that process effectively and making sure that actually that funding program delivers for your organization. So Kirsty, just to kick us off, what kind of things should people be considering when they're looking at grant funding?
I think quite often particularly when you'll be talking to line managers, they'll come in with a grant opportunity, and the first thing that the organisation will start to do is look at how you do it, when you're going to do it, which team it's going to go in, and you start immediately looking at that sort of operational deliverable level. And I would recommend to everybody, you've got to really take a few steps back and look at your overall strategy. Where does it fit in with the overall strategy of the organisation? So it's pull out your strategic plan, sit down with that and really look at where is it fitting in and what role is that actually going to play in the organisation. And it has to link to a strategic goal. It's very, very easy to chase dollars, but chasing dollars and getting dollars in is not always a good thing if it's going to cause issues down the track. So the thing we need to be thinking about is what role, what is this grant actually doing? Is it building the organisation's capability? Is it helping the organisation to expand? So there's a number of different ways you can expand. Are you expanding geographically? Are you expanding horizontally? So are you competing with other organisations? Are you looking at the supply chain or looking at your verticals? So are you going up or down the supply chain? Where does it actually sit? How does it suit the particular, organisational goals? Or is it supporting diversification? Because the objective is not to waste money on tendering. There's a lot of tendering you can be doing. You can be investing a lot of resources into writing great tenders, but they might actually be the wrong grants. And I've certainly seen this with a couple of organisations, particularly where the CEO is incentivised on and KPI'd on their revenue growth. And when you do that, you start to really stray away from that core purpose and the core objective of what you're trying to do and actually building the business and really just chasing dollars. We also need to think about what need is the grant fulfilling for your beneficiaries. So is it complementing or expanding the functions and the services that you provide? Is there evidence of demand for that service? Is the program design that's being offered or being suggested in this grant actually something you agree with? Because there's a lot of reputational or other risks that you can take on with grants. Some examples would be NDIS, the local area coordinator grants. Very early on, I remember speaking to an organisation who was very unhappy that they'd taken that on because the reputational risk that their organisation was facing because of the backlash in the way that program was supported and designed. Very similar to the Parents Next program, for example. If you're implementing the Parents Next program, Centrelink's putting in place some very difficult rules for participants to follow, but your organisation's the one that's bearing the brunt of that on their reputation. So there's a lot of issues around that in terms of, does the philosophy of what your organisation, is this actually going to support that? Another side of it is are the dollars sufficient to do the job? I mean, we all know there's insufficient funding, but if you know and you've got really good evidence that the demand that's out there for this particular service is substantially higher than what the funding envelope's going to give you, you need to be able to understand what you're actually taking on from that point of view. The other thing we think about is where do you find the grant? With any luck, it's a renewal. You can also be invited to get grants. Your accountants may send you information. There's obviously the federal government grant finders, but it's essentially resourcing and tasking it. And I'll throw to Edward because his team actually provides strategic advice on funding grants.
And I think, the dollars are attractive, and it's really understanding what does it take and what does it involve to apply for a particular bunch of funding, and is it a fully funded grant in terms of the grant will provide the full cost of the activity, or is it an expectation that the organisation has to make some form of co-contribution, whether that be in a cash form or whether that be as an in-kind or a mixture of the both, and understanding, so what are you taking on, and what it may not just be the incoming cash that's got to be concerned. It's what sort of is this grant going to cost you, and where's that cost being to be shared. And look, I guess there's different types of grant funding. There are those that are designed as more of a block funding for a period of years to support the operations and the service delivery of your organization. And then there are more project-based funding streams, which are more designed as a one-off. We're talking about that expansions, that the growth of an organization usually involves some form of capital expenditure. And often those require that co-funding, match funding, often on a dollar for dollar. For every dollar you take in grant funding, you're expected to provide one of your own in a cash form. Others, that ratio can differ, and there might be an acceptance of an in-kind contribution rather than just a straight cash component. And each of those grant programs are different. So I think when looking at your grant program, it's trying to sort of understand, I guess, that basic, what the mechanics of the funding that is offered. And then in terms of, what does that actually sort of the expectations of the funder. So there's two areas when you think you've landed on the right grant for you. Two areas to excuse me, to focus on. One is, are you eligible for the funding? Is this right for you? And the second, and more complex one and more difficult to assess, is how competitive will you be in the eyes of the funder? Now, we take the eligibility, that's really kind of the bare minimum standard that you've got to achieve. And really, that's where you should invest the most effort up front, is to make sure you're square in the wheelhouse of what that fund is trying to achieve. And there is no question mark of whether you may or may not be eligible, because when a fund is looking to do their assessment, they potentially, if they're funding a large cohort of 200-300 applications, they're going to use eligibility as a really hot tool in terms of, you do not fit the criteria, then you're out. All the good work that you've put together in terms of putting that compelling case as why you're the best application, that won't even get read. So you have to make sure that the eligibility criteria sort of are right in that sort of sweet spot, and use the opportunity to attend the webinar that the funder might have arranged, to review the guidelines in detail, give them a call, clarify those questions, have that early engagement, say, look, I've seen this funding, I'm thinking of a project that looks a bit like this. Is that the kind of thing that's going to fit with your anticipation and your expectations as a funder? Or am I better off perhaps, not going there and moving to something else? It helps you really sort of then make sure and identify, is this, because there's a significant amount of effort required putting together an application, is making sure that you're actually absolutely sort of in the right area before you go investing too much time. Because as I say, if you don't get it right, then you'll just be passed over straight away and your race is over before it started. So all those opportunities to engage with the funder, and it builds that sort of relationship, puts their project on, because they're looking to get the best projects. They're looking to be able to sort of say to their sort of management, and this is what we're trying to enable. Look at these great sort of projects we're supporting to deliver. So there's both sides of the scenario. And then competitive is about, first and foremost, understanding the process that you'll be asked to go through to apply. So in some instances, you might be some of the federal programs that operate on an ongoing basis where applications can be made at any time. There's an initial engagement with the funder where you have that conversation about your project, and they'll talk you through the ins and outs of it. And then based on the result of that conversation, they will invite you to put forward an expression of interest. And then if that is successful, then they'll ask you down the track to do a more detailed application. So in those kind of processes, you'll much be able to have that to and fro engagement. You'll get a sense at each stage of the program, of the process, how competitive your application is, and get some tips around how you refine it to maximum effect. Now, other programs is very much, it's here for these 6 weeks, put in your application, and there's very limited in terms of engagement. And so understanding the process is key, understanding the timeframes, and also when planning your project. Grants, one of the key rules is they do not fund historic expenditure. So you have to be thinking, I'm planning something for the future. And also grant funding takes time in terms of, so the sort of that stage process I talked about, you're probably looking somewhere up to 6 months for that process to run through. So you have to be thinking that far in advance. So if you need funding for something that's happening tomorrow, grants is not the forum for you because of the timeframes required. And so really making sure that you've got that understanding. And then when you're looking at a fund, one way to assess in terms of how competitive or it may well be is how much funding does the funder have available to give out in this particular chunk or this particular round. What's the size of the individual grant? So how diverse, how many chunks are they splitting that funding pool into? That gives you a sense of how many businesses there might be quite sort of targeted eligibility, so only businesses in this subsector or only businesses of this scale are eligible. So it gives you a sense of how competitive it might be and how hard you might have to work for that funding. And then it's kind of read the instructions, read the assessment criteria, and importantly the weighting. So they'll set out once you're eligible, we'll judge you against these 5 things, and we'll give you 50 points for that, 20 points for that, etc. And so really then, obviously clearly those that are higher weighted, you've got to make sure that you've got the really strong case against those criteria to give you a really good chance of being successful. What is the fund actually trying to achieve? With often, they're looking to support you as an organization, but not just you as an organization. They're putting the money into that industry for a purpose, to drive broader benefit across a broader sector, be it upskilling, job creation, access to new capability, new technology, really trying to understand what they're driving for. So then you can then talk to all those things in your application saying, this is what you are trying to achieve, and this is how we're going to help you get there. And it builds that that sort of compelling case for your application. And thinking beyond the status quo. So if you've been funded by a program in the past and you're going back again for a second round of funding and just proposing more of the same, is that going to cut the mustard? Is that really what they're looking for? Or are they expecting a continuous improvement in the services that you're offering and the approach that you're taking? So that next time, and I spoke to a client recently, and they'd just been back in terms of gone back to the sort of well again for another round of funding and were unsuccessful. And it was quite a significant thing for their organization because it was represented a large proportion of their funding. So they were sort of scrambling to think, oh, we've actually realized that keeping the lights on is going to be difficult without this funding. So it's important to make sure that you have that. An
example of that's a lot of with renewals. A lot of clients would just you put the same thing in again because that was successful last time. I think it's really important, that point around continuous improvement. I've seen grants where they think it's a cakewalk renewal, everything's going to be fine, and then somebody else comes in but actually puts in for a much more competitive and a much more compelling response, and really shows how you could take that program and improve it. And it's not just on costs, it's about the quality and everything else that they're doing. It's the reporting and the evidence that they're pulling together for that particular program, and they lost that grant because of that.
And I think, understanding that actually writing a compelling application does take a lot of effort, does take a lot of time, and it is a skill. And that whilst you may have the skills operationally to deliver you what's needed in your organization, those different skill sets, different in terms of that writing, often you don't have many words in each of the questions to respond. So putting that case in a kind of rich, compelling way, fact-based with, good narrative, actually is an acquired skill. So definitely making sure you've got the right support around your organization at that critical time. And that's something obviously RSM can help with, bringing that sort of fact-based compelling narrative together based on the sort of information data points that you can provide us.
I just had a question come through. You touched on it slightly before about good ways to, you might have a link or something that we could have a look at where you can identify new grants and funding, like where are good places for people to check for new ones that perhaps are coming out?
Sure. So there are a range of sites. So the federal government have a grant finder website. And I know that I'm in Western Australia, the Chamber of Commerce of Western Australia also have a grant finder. Some of the large funding federal bodies on their website will have, funding tabs and sort of say, come, have a look here. So there's a range of different sources. And then there are subscription services that you can sign up to, Grant Guru being one of them, that has database of all the application or the programs, billions of dollars available across Australia at any one time. So
can I apply as an individual? Good one.
Mixture of free and paid sources.
I just posted the government grant finder link in the chat. But yeah, we can, generally there's a lot of different, and it also depends on the sector. Some sectors you can go to your peak body. You can also look at, different ways, different networks. For example, National Disability Services, for example, in the disability sector, will do a lot of support around those sorts of things.
Right. Thanks.
So
I saw one of the questions pop up. Would ChatGPT help with a grant application? Maybe.
I think it would give you a draft to work from, but I would never submit something that ChatGPT produced. I think that if you were looking to try and get some words and a structure and a few things like that together, look, I could say it's like any tools that you've got. It would help you in terms of maybe getting it, but it's a starting point. You could never actually submit that. I think
well,
it could be quite dangerous to submit, actually. What has ChatGPT committed us to doing? Yeah.
But it is the whole 80-20 rule. You probably get you most of the way there, but you really need that sort of critical overlay to really make sure that it does actually is drawing on relevant topics and hitting the right notes, not just something that's sort of been found to be popular on internet searches. So yeah, like anything, tools have their place, but it's nothing. You need to make sure that it's very. And I guess when you're assessing an application, what the assessors are looking at is any way to say no, because they're often they've got way more demand than they have supply, and so therefore then any old excuse, or not any old excuse, but any sort of justifiable excuse to say, look, we've got to pass over this one because of this reason. So they're not looking to help you. They're looking to kind of say no to you because their role is to find only the best and, put 50 million into a $5 million hole.
Yep. So I think we're up to putting together a compelling application.
Yeah. So I think the thing with once you're clear that you're eligible for the grant, you've got a good story in your mind in terms of what your story and your compelling narrative is going to be, then you've got to put that into action and put something actually into your submission. And what funders are looking at is this a credible application? Is this the kind of application that and the project that, as it's outlined, going to be fit for purpose and deliver what I'm looking for? And credibility there's no secret sauce, but there are a number of ingredients that can help. And I guess some of the sort of big tips are: don't go into the application with or assuming that the funder understands your organization, understands your project. You have a very often quite a short, amount of characters or words to put together a succinct summary of your organization, of your project, and be clear on what that project is. What one of the pitfalls people can often fall into is they start talking of the grand future vision around this is what we're going to deliver, and it's not clear in the narrative is the funding that's going to be brought by the funder going to deliver all of that, or what component?
It's been really clear on outcomes, but if you talk too much about outcomes, you don't actually talk about outputs. What is it you're actually doing? I think so. It's important to link what it is that you're actually doing in the project to the outcomes that you're going to achieve.
And often the the form will segregate those two. Tell us what you're going to deliver and what were the benefits. What's the so what? How is that going to translate into the outcomes and the change that we're looking to drive? So being clear around what your project is and what are you going to be funding? What are you asking for funding for? What aspects of the project that you're putting forward are you asking for funding? And what sort of contribution will you be making in terms of that split?
Kirsty, I'd love to know, I mean, you spoke, it was a really interesting point there, that sometimes, you can go to that grand vision. Perhaps you could talk to a little bit more about that in that application process and what you've seen.
Part of it's about demonstrating and not, another part of this is like demonstrating but not claiming capability. So saying we're really good at this. So we're really fantastic at providing this service Y, but not actually saying we provide service Y. We're good at this because we provide these services across 45 areas, across 600 clients, across this. It's actually showing the evidence behind what it is that you're doing, and it's taking a risk-based approach when you're explaining that, and that's where you let your experience show through. But to your point about how do you actually explain that difference between outcomes and outputs and really define what it is? There's a lot of the time that you'll read a grant application and it's very the language that's used to describe what you're doing, it's very outcomes theoretical based. And so, but it doesn't actually give the person who's reading it, if they don't know the sector very well, they don't know the jargon very well, then you can actually read an entire paragraph and not really understand what they're actually doing. That sounds funny, but it's, because it's all, it's all very esoteric and it's about the outcomes that we're delivering. So if you're doing something for families, it's about wonderful outcomes and you talk about this, but what you're not actually explaining that you're actually going to employ staff to do this service, to go into people's homes, to meet with them, to do that. So actually explaining what some of that is and then linking it into whatever the framework it is that they've, that you're working in.
Yeah, so being quite detailed and granular rather than, I think that's probably the risk of using ChatGPT is you would end up with very generic, very high level, and you're not going to have that kind of hard evidence-based approach for when someone's reading it to be like, oh yeah, that's why. I can see almost like dot points, like that's it. Yep.
And being really clear on outputs. So, we're going to run this particular type of group. And so we're going to employ the people that will help make this group happen. But then you're not actually saying how many groups you actually think you're going to make happen. So I think it's a much more powerful proposition to say, if you give us the supports to, we'll fund staff and we'll fund this, we'll set this service up, but we're then going to deliver that to X number of people, X number of hours, X number of whatever, you actually put some good hard metrics around it. So it's really clear. And I think that's a lot more powerful than not having the specifics in there.
I'm speaking
users.
I'm speaking a lot out of space, but I'm just thinking about, I'm putting together at the moment a plan for requests for workforce planning and resourcing for next year. And it's all based around, if I hit this milestone, that I want this. But if I can't get these resources, then I can only deliver this, for example. Is there any place for that when you're just talking about, how many teams? Like if I can get funding for 50 grand as opposed to 200.
I think it's a really important point. It's like when we think about value for money, so it's another section we're talking about in a minute, but I might just pull that forward a bit. You want to be really framing value for money. There's a lot of different ways you can explain value for money. The first thing is each funder will have their own criteria that they use. So AIFs, which is used in DSS, for example, have a volume, value, efficiency type model. New South Wales government has a slightly different model. So first of all, use the model that the funder uses. But you really want to get through to, in your application, all of those points around how you can demonstrate value for money and the benefit, therefore what the cost benefit is. So it's really putting together a business case. And the business case is, how we're going to do this efficiently, how we're going to do this not necessarily cheaply, how have this debate with not-for-profits quite a bit, but we do it cheaply. We don't spend a lot of money, yes, but you're doing your payroll in Excel, and you've got people I mean, literally last year we had somebody whose staff were taking photographs of their timesheets and texting it to somebody, and you're paying somebody an entire salary just to pull all those timesheets together. Yes, it's cheap because it's Excel, but if you actually put a system in place, it might cost you a little bit this year, but you will actually cut those costs in your overhead, by an entire salary, if you can put an automated system, not to mention the risk benefits that gives you.
We had a lot of not-for-profits that use, lots of different housing, like women's support, childcare, just in terms of like systems. And there was one person that was tasked with just driving around to give them money for groceries or whatever, or like, and just that, there can be, ways that there are sort of.
That's why your product exists, but it's exactly automating just makes, look, it's hard because there aren't grants to automate very often. You've really got to go and look for that sort of grants to fund infrastructure development and IT development are few and far between. They do exist, you can get them, but usually you have to go to a foundation or somebody that's trying to invest in the sector, to get that kind of funding to help you. But that's one of the problems with a lot of grants. Actually, not-for-profits don't often get funded for things like R&D. They don't get funded for systems development, tool development, infrastructure, building. But if you can get those things in place, you can actually put a very powerful cost together. I mean, we've applied activity-based costing methodologies to sectors like arts, to playgroups, to a range of different not-for-profit type businesses. And it's always fascinating when you do that. To give you an NDIS example, when we did some of those early transitions, the NDIS cost model has, for example, a benchmark of 10.5% of direct costs for overheads. And we were finding that, and still to this day, most organisations are sitting in the 30% level. And during COVID, it went as high as 50 because they were carrying overhead through COVID. So you've then got things like productivity. So when you get a grant, you'll usually have a top-down budgeting approach and you set and forget it. But it's really important that you, sorry, it's somebody trying to ring me.
Top-down approach.
Yeah. So when you're sorry, apologies for that, everyone. When you have a top-down budgeting approach, you tend to put everything down and you lay it out the way you think it should be done. But whereas when you actually look at, for example, staff utilization, we were doing analysis where we had staff utilization of 40%, and the benchmark in the NDIS is like 90% plus. So automatically you can start to see that, when you've got really high overheads, you also might be paying people at a higher level. Your actual efficiency in terms of the service pricing or the service costing and pricing can be very, very high under a grant fund. And if you want to stack that up against other businesses, it can be very inefficient. So one of the easy ways that is to deploy as much of your resources as possible into your frontline services. And that will give you in straight overnight a really, really compelling, proposition just from that. So, I guess that sort of brings us to thinking about accountability as well. So if you can be accountable in terms of the types of efficiency and the service pricing and the service costing, actually putting more of the resources of the grant into frontline services. And then you also are able to really layer onto that strong program logics, inputs and outputs and costings and deliverables. Then, you end up with a very, very powerful grant application. And the other point I'd make is that you want to fully cost the deliverables. So when you're having to go into conducting surveys and running reports, doing the actual cost of acquittals, there's a lot of things that sort of fall through the gaps when you're doing that initial grant application or when you're costing it. You've got to fully cost that proposal to make sure that you're not going to be down the track trying to figure out how you fund X number of hours of time to actually acquit the grant, report against the grant, and do all the things that you need to do to fulfill the terms of the agreement.
Mm.
And I think the other thing that sort of builds that sort of compelling case, and the government look at a lot, is something that's, we refer to as additionality. So often grants guidelines say we're looking for projects that are both eligible and additional, and often that's quite where the grant funding is in relation to sort of a more a one-off or a project-based activity, as opposed to a block funding that funds operations. Additionality comes in there quite strongly. So in terms of saying, well, what would happen if you didn't get government funding? What is the difference that government is going to make by giving you a portion of the funds towards your project? Is the project going to happen at all without grant funding? Is it going to happen, but maybe just not now, maybe in 2 years' time? Or is it going to happen, but maybe only phase one can be achieved, so therefore only a portion of the attached benefits can be achieved? So being really clear in terms of, and that's what government are looking for in terms of the project to have that strong additionality. There's a strong reason why government has to address some form of market failure, to bring some form of funding into place to make these benefits. Without this funding, these benefits would not be unlocked. They wouldn't be unlocked as quickly or as fully, and making sure that that it's that you're clear on what benefits your project will deliver, not only to your organization but to the broader sector. So will it have a strong impact on the region in which you operate? Will it link with the needs of the community? Will it sort of bring jobs? Will it bring new capability, new training and skills opportunities? What else, apart from just giving your organization a leg up, what else will it do? And then more of those sort of points that you can make in terms of, it's going to support capability, it's going to support community cohesion, et cetera, More of those you have, the stronger your application, the harder it will be, the less opportunity the assessors will have to say, well, we can't fund this one, because it gives them left to go on. So that's a key point, and really making sure that works.
And it's, what is your organisation bringing that nobody else can? And often that's community networks, linkages, understanding. You've already got a footprint there. A good example is like in foster caring. So in foster caring, if you're administering that service, you might have some children that need to, be put into care, say, and we found out about it now, and they're going in tonight, and we need to find 3 beds to go into that person's house, because the person who's going to take them doesn't have beds. And if you've got a good community network up, you can ring 4 or 5 people, and next thing you know, there's beds being delivered. So it's, whereas somebody who's coming into a market cold doesn't have that same advantage. So I think it's really thinking outside the box and thinking holistically around, what else is the organisation bringing to this that is unpaid, if you like, which can be expertise, capability, networks, all those types of things.
We've had 2 questions come in. I don't know if it's an okay time for me to pose them.
Sure.
So we've had one from Steve, saying that there are local, state and federal grants available. And while there are similar grant programs available, could you please explain how perhaps complementary or competing would just be using 2 different agencies? So the grant program funds into the same eligible project.
I think they're, I guess it's where I've seen this with one of my clients, where they actually have both the state and the federal government funding essentially of the same service. Is that what you're talking about? I think the really key thing to do there is to delineate for the federal government what it is that they're doing as a base, and for the state government what they're doing that's adding to that, so that you've got a really clear delineation in the programs between what it is that you're delivering for each of those funders, and showing how the sum of those parts is greater than if you don't get it. Yeah.
And leveraged funding is always highly regarded. So if you bring 2 million to the party, then the feds will come to the party as well. Or we'll put it as a private sector organisation, we'll put in 10 million as well. So having sort of for the funder to be able to claim that their dollar resulted in another $50 of investment is actually quite a powerful statistic. Perhaps we can talk about sort of the last component in terms of once you've gone all the hard yards, you've put together that, you smashed it out of the park, you've got that agreement, you've got that letter saying congratulations, you've been awarded a grant. What next? How do you actually make that part of the process work? And so often the process will be that the funder will come to you and say, congratulations, you've been awarded this amount of funding. It may be conditional. It may be conditional subject to meeting certain approvals. We'll make this funding available, or we can move straight to the signing up to the agreement in terms of how we will operate and manage the grant. So what doesn't happen is the minister or the whoever does not turn up at your office with a novelty check and hand over the $100,000, the $700,000. It happens. It's over time, and often it's about that process of payment based on milestones and achievement of certain activities. And so, but the grants are managed by where I work called was a funding assistance agreement. It probably has different names across different programs, but essentially it's a legally binding contract between you as the organization and the funder. And it sets out in terms of the terms and conditions of what that legal contract is governed by, and the role and responsibilities of you as the recipient, and what the funder's responsibilities in terms of how you have to report on things and so forth. What happens if it goes wrong? What are the rights of each party if things start to go south? And that's a really important document, because that is what is going to govern the whole delivery of your project. And you are being asked to sign up to a complex legal document. So it's really important to take the right advice, particularly legal advice and expertise advice, in terms of what is it, by signing this document, what am I going to be held to? Both in terms of sort of the legal terms and conditions, but then often in the schedules of that agreement, then it's the things that are tailored to your particular program. So being clear that it clearly outlines this is the project and this is what's going to be funded, and what are the mechanics of that funding, both in terms of if that funding is spread over a period of time, what are the milestones? What evidence do you have to provide to unlock those chunks of funding, and be clear and understand? And often that can be a negotiation. So if your project has a big chunk of expenditure up front, and then smaller chunks over time, there's often opportunity to have a conversation with the funder to sort of make sure those milestones marry that cash flow of your project. So that because often the expectation is a $1 million project, the government will tip in 500,000, but you have to spend the money and then claim money back over time once you've met that milestone. So if you're having to spend your cash flow in large chunks, you want to marry your milestones so that you're not front loading the cash flow for too long. So that very quickly you can meet your milestone, go to the government, say, look, can I now have my $200,000, please? To make sure that and that's when planning your project, you need to understand that cash flow, and do you have the resources to deliver the project, and sort of front load that expenditure and then reclaim it, and how are you going to sort of in the background, what resources are you going to use to manage those ebbs and flows in the cash flow? And again, it comes down to communication right up front in that discussion around when negotiating the agreement, making sure that it fits the purpose, suits the needs of the timeframes of your project. And also as part of that agreement, what we'll set out in terms of the obligations, in terms of when the project is finished, what evidence and information does the funder require from you? So both in terms of the outcomes and outputs that you have delivered, but also in terms of record keeping of are they going to want to see all the invoices that ever were in relation to this project, or would it be to high level financial summary prepared by an authorized accountant sufficient? What are the expectations? So you don't come to the end of the project having done all the great work, and then as part of the financial acquittal, not have the evidence that you need to justify the expenditure.
And that means you need really strong internal processes where the CFO has got to sign off on anything financial. Don't let your line managers just do a budget summary without getting your oversight, because at some point you'll end up down the track in a report having to justify why it's different because it wasn't done properly in the first place. I've seen that a few times.
We are
And I
getting
think,
last
yeah,
few
sorry.
minutes.
Yep.
We've also got some questions. So whether you guys want to wrap up your section 4, whether we want to jump into questions, we've got 4 minutes.
The only thing I would just really quickly, just in terms of just making sure that you're resourcing the grant properly and planning it up front. So don't be scrambling around trying to do surveys and reporting and all those things at, just before the report's due. You want to be putting those things in place right up front, again, to support cash flow, staffing, and all the other things that you're going to need for the grant. So really do your work up at the beginning of the grant project. Often everyone's excited, they've got it happening, they want to get it up and running, but you really need to think about what is the overall deliverables that need to be done, and are we set up to do that? And the other side of it, and that also has to have a strong risk management process. So making sure that you've got good procurement controls, fraud controls, you're managing your end contract dates and your milestones, all those types of things. So I think we can go to questions.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you there. So go on. So grants that don't have a specific line item for bank revaluation or foreign exchange variance, how do you effectively convince the grantor to get these costs adjusted? Otherwise, the organisation has to bear those costs themselves.
I would say if you're in a situation where that is now, you're just going to have to sit down and work with the grantor and discuss with them about the costs. If I was going in to pitch for that grant now or tender for that grant, I'd be putting an allowance in. So you put in an allowance at the beginning where you say, all right, foreign currency could vary by up to this, and we're going to put in a contingency. And so what you do is have a contingency in that fund to allow for that foreign exchange. And so that you're effectively planning for it up front. But I think that's a tough one if you're hitting that now.
So I think it's our final question. So from Desi, is it just here in Queensland or does it happen Australia-wide? But it seems Commonwealth and state start to have conditional contracts that most grants go directly to client and staff wages, but don't have enough funding for management.
I think that goes to my point around efficiency. So what they're trying to do in that sense is control the amount of funding that is going towards frontline services without giving you a unit price. So I think for that point, there's an expectation. It's really being able to demonstrate that you're running the grant as efficiently as possible, and they want to make sure that the overall grant management you're not spending most of the money on the grant management. I mean, we've done some activity-based costing analysis where 60% of the grant is being spent on essentially overhead and management, running it, stuff, and not actually going into frontline services. And that's really not good. So I think the question I would say is that reasonable for the type of grant it is? And really have a good hard look at the structure of and your team structures. DSS has learnt a lot from the NDIS around how efficiently things can be delivered, and that's probably the tightest benchmark you'll find, along with aged care. So there's certainly a lot of pressure across the whole sector, I think, to drive efficiency, and that's where you'll see those kinds of limits and restrictions coming in. I would say you sort of get taken aback with that, but lean into it and figure out how you can do that. Yeah.
Kirsty and Edward, thank you so much. Really appreciated you sharing your time with us this morning and your expertise. Next up in the summit, we have strategies for not-for-profit cost optimization. So go grab a cup of tea, a coffee. We'll see you in 10 minutes. We will be sending through a recording, but of course, if you've got any more questions, please send them through. We want to get as many eyes on your questions. So happy to help in any way that we can. And over the next few sessions, Kirsty mentioned that unfortunately often there aren't so many grants for your tech, but we're getting some discounts and special not-for-profit offerings for a lot of the great tech solutions to help you guys save extra cash and put it where it matters most. So again, thanks very much, and especially big thank you for those in Perth. I know it's an early morning, so give us feedback if you guys want to have another session, a take 2 with extra questions, or get in a little bit detail or a specific part of the not-for-profit space. Happy to hear all that feedback. Thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you soon. Bye.
Thank you. See ya.